Hello, everyone. Today, I'm excited to be joined by Paul Kim, a highly respected advisor with over 30 years of experience in DC, shaping FDA and public health policy. Throughout his career, Paul has advised patient advocates, global health life science leaders, and emerging companies on navigating complex regulatory landscapes, developing legislative strategies, and securing critical funding. His expertise spans drug and device law, rare disease innovation, public health, biodefense, and much more. Paul, welcome to Katalyze. Thank you for joining the
Thanks, Brandy.
conversation today.
This is great. Thank you so much for making time for me.
Yeah, absolutely. So, we would love to hear a little bit of your background, with over 30 years of experience in DC, advising on FDA policy, public health. Can you share a bit about your career journey and how your work has evolved in shaping the future of drug and device regulation?
Absolutely. I will say now I'm in a place where, as a solo consultant, I'm able to enjoy this field and interact with clients and issues in a way that is really optimal for me. Uh, I spent 20 years at a law firm leading their FDA and government strategies practices, and that was really great experience working with great people. But it's in an institution, like any institution, and so being a solo practitioner, I just report to myself, and I find that to be a real joy.
I bet. I can only imagine.
And before that, as you pointed out, I did work in the Congress on FDA and public health issues for the late Senator Kennedy, for Congressman Henry Waxman, now retired, for Senator David Pryor, late David Pryor of Arkansas, and managed to work on some really interesting laws and really interesting issues. Things that now, looking with 2020 hindsight, are, I think, almost like indicators or suggestive of the kinds of things that are changing in life science now. And we're seeing some remarkable things happening. I know this is what we're talking about today. So it was a great journey. I spent some time at FDA as well, for patient advocacy groups in the past, and working for biopharma itself, on the ground in Europe. But looking back, it's you just have to pinch yourself. The time goes so quickly. just you think that, oh, that was in 2002, and then you realize, oh my God, that was 20 years ago, right?
It's hard to believe, isn't it? And a
Yeah,
lot has changed.
so much. Yeah, absolutely. And I know that that's one of the topics that we want to talk about today.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It kind of just starting here, emerging life science companies often face regulatory hurdles. From your experience, what are the key challenges those companies encounter when navigating FDA regulations, and how can they better position themselves for success?
That's a great question, Brandy. And I think it depends really on where those companies are in their own life cycles. If they're an
Hmm.
emerging company, becoming familiar and understanding, truly understanding what, say, the FDA's requirements are for their field, for their area, is very, very difficult, can be. And being able to work with collaborators like principal investigators or former regulatory experts who used to work at the agency, patient groups, who bring their own points of view, their own experiences, that is just invaluable and is, I think, a part of the process of product development. But, putting those pieces together can be an extraordinary challenge for any given company. For the more
Okay.
sophisticated, more experienced companies, the big pharmas and others, what the biggest challenge for them may well be is when the requirements change. You have 30 years of
Right.
experience, right, in a given area,
Yes.
and suddenly the goalposts start to move. Whatever, maybe
Hmm.
there's a judicial decision, or there's a change in administration, which increasingly, as you know, can modulate what those legal requirements are, even more so than changes in black letter law. Yeah.
Hmm.
Those can be extraordinarily challenging for them. And I think ultimately for the consumers, the people we have to think about and care about and work for from day one, the patients and their families, um, it frequently feels, I think, that they are on the outside of a black box of product development, and
Absolutely.
and finding ways into that process. When you don't have capital, when you don't have that expertise necessarily, you only have the life experience and the knowledge of how that disease burdens you and your family. Um, I think that challenge is a perennial one, uh,
Hmm.
and and I know that sponsors and regulators. investigators are increasingly more sensitive to the need to account for patient perspectives, to develop endpoints reflecting patient experience. I think that's changing and for the better. So I think that's where I would end with that question.
Yeah, no, I think that that's a really interesting because that is something that I think gets overlooked often is
Yeah.
bringing that audience into the mix. And where would you recommend, like, for a company to engage with the actual potential patients?
Yeah, and you'll find that they've become more sophisticated, right? We now have, people who are tasked with ally development or patient engagement, and
Mm-hmm.
their titles reflect that, their missions and their job descriptions reflect that. I think that is great. So it's not allocated to, on one side, medical affairs, where they're just dealing with the protocols and standing up trials, or post hoc on the commercial side, trying to sell drug, right, and trying to get endorsement. And so I think that is a maturation, if you will, of product development, and a good one.
Yeah, absolutely. It's nice to see that focus kind of shifting, especially earlier in the process.
Yeah.
Kind of thinking about public health policy and innovation, which is incredibly integral to innovation and new drugs and devices. How have recent public health initiatives and policies influenced the development of life sciences, and where do you see the biggest areas for improvement?
Yeah, boy, Brandy, this is such a timely question.
I
We're
bet.
all
Yeah.
of us coming emergent out of this post-pandemic experience,
Yeah.
right? And everybody knows how to do a nasal swab for a test, right? Everybody knows what the importance of immunization is, or discounts that, right? And
Right.
I think,
Right.
yes, and everything has to be seen, I think, in a post-COVID lens.
Hmm.
And one of the things that I think is on the upside, the good news, right, is the extraordinary success of the mRNA vaccines. I think before 2020, I would have said it'll take 18 months to stand up a vaccine that's responsive to an emergent strain that threatens global health, right? And we did it in half that time. I mean, it's
Yeah.
extraordinary story, right?
Hmm.
Nobel worthy news in science. But the downside was the public health response, and as you noted, just how the communities responded. I think the failures and the successes of public health authorities to communicate effectively with the public. We've learned a lot, but I think if we come out to a second strain, another challenge, comparable to COVID-19, will we do as well? I think we might do worse. I think in many ways, in terms of emerging with a communal response that is actually uh, geared to the most effective public health response. I
Yeah.
think there are more people who are going to sit out. We're going to have a harder time working through the misinformation. We have multiple channels of authority, or quote unquote authority. Those things are going to be extraordinarily challenging, and you have to hope that the next virus, the next pathogen, is not more lethal.
Right.
It sounds like doom and gloom, I know, but that's, I think, the takeaway from your very, very good question. Those are the takeaways I get, like what's going to happen next and how are we going to respond.
Yeah, it was really interesting, right? The public response to the vaccine, and just what what is the responsibility of public health agencies, and what do you think was the huge misstep, I guess, in that?
It's a great question. We think about swine flu, from the 70s as the federal missteps. We dropped the ball. We ended up, not to use any sports metaphors, but we ended up, on the 10th-yard line behind. And here, we had this modern miracle of this effective vaccine, and that we had such skepticism about its deployment, and we had so many questions. I think that what blunted an effective deployment of the vaccine, something commensurate with the experience that we had with polio or smallpox, for example, right, where neighborhoods would line up for the Salk vaccine. Why didn't that happen? Which, in Brand, I think you again put your finger right on the right question, really the most important question. I think the masking, the isolation, the public health interventions really generated such skepticism and concern, like, do we really need to isolate in our homes? Probably not. Like, I think a lot of that was probably not timed well, or gradiented well, metriced well. Whereas the vaccine was sort of like a one-stop shop solution. Go get your shots, right? And I think we have to think about how we try to deploy all those countermeasures, all those interventions simultaneously. What was most important? Probably getting in people's arms. I mean, and granted, that came after the isolation and so forth. So, I hate to do this Monday morning quarterbacking, but I think you put your finger right on, like, well, geez, what was it that didn't make this miracle feel and look like a miracle to everybody?
Yeah, and I think about just kind of going back to something that you said, just pivoting this conversation a bit, but um, it was really incredible how fast this was able to come to market. I mean, obviously, some of the challenges was supply,
Yes,
distribution. So
absolutely.
as we kind of move along in this conversation, thinking about that aspect and kind of pivoting to the future, like not to be again doomsday, but
Hmm.
it's likely that this is going to happen again.
Yes,
And
yes.
how do you see technology innovation, like what we're seeing with companies like Katalyze? It seems to me like things will be able to move faster on at least that side of things. Like, walk me through your perception of this.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And part of the problem that we have now is, we need to preemptively socialize. We need to be engaging in conversation with skeptical people, people who are naysayers, as well as people who are open, receptive to uses of these kinds of technologies. Explain why they're being used. Explain how they can make an improvement in your lives. Really bring it home. Having worked on the Hill, my bosses used to always talk about the critical importance of getting back to constituent within the same day. Like, they would not have it if you were like letting that lie. That stuff doesn't belong at the bottom of the pile; it belongs at the top of the pile. And I think for innovators, the challenge is, you need to make that part of your day job, not only part of your day job, but top of your pile. Um, that's incredibly challenging now, as we talked about. But I can't see any way to avoid that. If you want to avoid somebody basically saying, no, I'm going to close the door to this, or this is not part of my solution set, or this is not important to my family. When you get that reaction, working your way back out of it or digging yourself out of that, I don't see how you can do that. Once people have made up their minds about things, I think it's very hard to turn them around.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I guess this kind of like carries into the manufacturing innovation sector, right? Where you start to bring in some of these new technologies to improve your processes. With the rise of AI in healthcare, like how do you see AI transforming regulatory science, particularly in drug approval process and device regulation?
It's a great question. If we take today as a benchmark, I think the latest numbers coming out of the FDA, for example, is I think we've gotten maybe 300 or 400 drug or biological product submissions with AI. And for devices, I think that's 700, 800, closer to 1,000. So, as we all feel like it, we are really literally just at the crescent. This wave is just beginning to hit. And, you
Yes.
know, there's no question, I think, that the agency itself in isolation completely lacks the capacity to address this, right? And we hear Dr. Califf, the current commissioner, talk about the need for partnership, right? Finding ways to validate through the use of health systems, and being equivocal, not being conclusive in understanding whether something works well or works as described or as intended. Um, and I think that gets to a really fundamental question of when the FDA clears or approves a product. For AI, for drugs, for everything else under the sun, for a regulated product, it's pretty categorical. The thing has gotten a seal of approval. But
Right.
to your question, for AI, I think not just because we're talking about maybe black boxes or generative models, which, you need to have special expertise to really interrogate. I think inherently we're looking at products that are now reaching marketplace for use by health systems, providers, patients, consumers, right? That are inherently experimental
Mhm.
because of the sheer novelty, as you said, of the underlying technology. And so that requires, to get back to our earlier conversation, a level of trust and engagement that may well be unprecedented. right? You know, we
Yeah.
used to be in a very paternalistic medical culture and increasingly self-empowered and consumer and patient empowered. But at the same time, these tools are now coming into play where not even the FDA, I think, could say with conclusive confidence it's 100%, right? You know, it's
Right.
more
Yeah.
than not. Yeah, you know, that's a fundamental pivot. I think that's a fundamental change, not just in terms of the agency's inability to do it by themselves, where they do a drug review essentially by themselves, but now they're relying on community assets and knowledge and expertise, community experience. I think they need to start recasting how they talk about products. And I'm not even sure they can do that under the law. I mean, I think the way the law is written, you know, I think Dr. Califf has said this, former Commissioner Scott Gottlieb has said this, you know, the law is cast to address, you know, 20th century technologies.
Right.
We may need to revisit that.
Yeah. Yeah. So I guess, kind of even just thinking about efficiency, right, in this process, because I think anyone who works in the industry understands how long it takes to get through the approval process, the many setbacks, and honestly, just the as you mentioned earlier in this conversation, the group of experts that you have to enlist in order to make sure that everything runs smoothly.
Yeah.
So, do you see some opportunities here for AI to maybe improve efficiency in this process?
Yeah, I think there is, you know, and I'm worried about actually, of all things, and maybe we're just too close to last Tuesday. But, you know, what we see now is a wave that is going to inevitably mean more deregulatory approaches to the field. And
Right.
right? And
Yes.
maybe that's
Yes.
good, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't think the agency was sort of in an aggressive regulatory posture, right? They weren't like saying, you know, we got to put our stamp on everything. Whoa, 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 slow down. You know, I think they were about engagement, reliance on stakeholders and partners, right? But I do think that accompanying that sort of deregulatory mindset, Brandy, is going to be, I think, a real skepticism towards resourcing the agency, right? It's going to be less about big government. So they don't want government to get any bigger. If that pushes down the agency's ability to hire, to contract for, you know, to even show up, you know, I'm thinking about travel budgets, right? To show up to
Right.
meetings, right? To
Yes.
talk to
Yes.
people in the field, that'll be bad. And
Right.
you know, so I think folks in the field, this is paradoxical in a way, but
Mm,
you know, we should probably be pushing for fully funding the FDA's travel budgets, right? Their ability to engage in these inherently collaborative regulatory postures. I don't think they're going to move away from that. I think they understand but they're not going to get. I think Dr. Kale said, we're not going to hire 10,000 more doctors, which
right.
is right.
Yeah.
You
This
know?
is like not going to happen. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So, you know, what is it what's in our best interest? Possibly just making sure that the FDA doesn't lose 15, 20% of their budget. Because if they do, I guarantee you they're just going to, like a turtle. And a turtle can't hear or see anything inside its shell. So, so I think, you know, in the short term, that might be a priority.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I could definitely see that. And perhaps even just like using it's hard because these agencies, it's like you said, like a lot has stayed the same.
Yeah.
But being able to even just embrace AI as maybe even a collaborative tool for them
Mm-hmm.
to be
Mm-hmm.
able to get through some of these barriers that
Yeah.
currently exist and perhaps might become even more so of a barrier. Um,
Yeah.
that could be a place where it's like a little baby steps into entering into this new generation of innovation.
Absolutely. I think that's exactly right, Brandy. And I think that in a sense, it's a go slow, but it's also a need to sort of move very quickly on problems or issues we already know we have. I mean, one thing is like, right, the technology is such that it's possible to do things that were beyond human capacity. Like we do, they AIs and these systems and models can do things that we can't actually. Not just things that we can do it faster or maybe more efficiently. It can do things that we can't do. And
Right.
so, you know, it's not about sort of reading a scan and detecting a cancer that a radiologist could detect. This is about other capabilities. So with that as a set of challenges, you know, we already know about sort of bias, right? The problems with the diversity of data sets in which they've been educated and trained, right? I think those issues are ones that inescapably have to be addressed early, because I think about the way that regulation changes. Regulation has usually been predicated on disasters, right?
Right.
Thalidomide, elixir sulfanilamide in the drug space, breast implants, medical device amendments of 76, so there are always these products that, run right into the wall at human cost. And we need to avoid that
Hmm.
for these emergent tools and technologies. How do we do that? I think it's about enabling these partnerships and conversations, and, driving consensus as quickly as possible and aggressively as possible, because we are setting standards globally. I mean, I think what we do
Yes.
matters globally. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, that is, I think, a problem to sustain if we are in a deregulatory world now, for at least for the foreseeable future. One that wants to see government smaller, and I think we just need to be understanding that the FDA gets the joke, at least from what I'm hearing, right? Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
we need to explore
Absolutely.
that. Yeah.
Yeah, no, yes. I mean, I think you are absolutely spot on. And kind of thinking about like transitioning to kind of more like life science, rare disease, all
Hmm.
these spaces, right? Especially in rare diseases,
Yeah.
um, because there really is, I think, with all this information, all this data, there's a real opportunity. I mean, you've spent a lot of time in this space. There's a real opportunity to start making a significant impact in
Yes.
rare disease that hasn't previously existed.
Yes, exactly right, Brandon. And I think we can catalog, the different ways, whether it's identifying and repurposing the models and molecules that have been previously tested in humans. Dr. Hagenbaum's project, which got ARPA-H funding, extremely exciting. The fact that the FDA is standing up this rare disease innovation hub to engage in these conversations, I think that's exactly just right. And again, thinking about this sort of the deregulatory environment, and maybe that's going to slow things down or hinder things, I think, unfortunately, because as you said, these opportunities are just waiting for us to address. I think we've identified, thousands and, 9,000, 7,000 rare diseases. Clearly there are more, and they're just waiting to be identified using these kinds of tools. And once you do that, can we modulate existing platform technologies, ASOs, and other promising technologies, for very rare and N of one diseases? Yeah, I think we can. We can treat out, and so I think the regulatory tools are there, and I think the
Mhm.
willingness is there. So it part of this is, I think, is making this a priority. Um, and when I say making a priority, Brandy, actually, it's not just about getting people to agree that there's a problem and that there's a solution set that can be brought to bear. It's really making sure you're not cut 15% in appropriation.
Right, right.
It's
Yes,
kind
that
of,
it still has a place in the budget.
yes,
Yeah.
exactly. A very
Yes.
retail level. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And kind of even just thinking about kind of sticking on this rare disease topic, I can't remember what was the number again of the currently, as we know, of the
Yeah.
number of rare
Oh,
diseases.
300 drugs and biologics with AI, some component of AI. Yeah, yeah.
But I'm thinking about drug personalization, right? Because
Yes.
all of these rare diseases, like we it feels like we kind of treat them with
Hmm.
what's already
Yeah,
existing. It's almost just like a Frankenstein approach almost to treatment,
exactly.
because
Hmm.
there really isn't
Yeah,
um, something that's it's hard to invest money into something that's like maybe affecting like
right.
20 people, or the small
Exactly.
number
Yeah,
of human
yeah,
beings. But
exactly.
with technology, perhaps there is a space where we start to see more of this personalization, which is truly what it's going to take to address some of these rare diseases.
100%. Yeah, 100%, Brandy. And I think, there is the perceived understanding that there's no one to step in really to resource something like that. You have the clinicians treating patients, the patients at these centers of excellence, and then you have, potentially applicable drug candidates or platform technologies that could be applied. But then how do you pay for that?
Right.
Certainly the health plan won't, right? Because it's inherently experimental, right? It's not commercially viable even under the Orphan Drug Act, because it's for one, 5 patients, 10 patients, and nobody builds a commercial drug out of that. So yeah,
Right.
I think you're right. Those are challenges that need to be answered. And there are great organizations like Nord, with whom I work,
Mhm.
the Ann Lorem Foundation, others who see this as their mission. But you need to find the audience, right? And as we talked about the retail politics, who will pay for that? How can we secure that resource commitment to answer those patients' needs? Yeah, I think it's still a puzzle that hasn't been solved yet.
Yeah, and I think there is maybe even an opportunity for private sector, right? If there is like leveraging AI, generative AI, using these complex data models to be able to pivot quickly and
Yeah.
make kind of carve that out as your
Mhm.
niche, versus
Yes.
like where we're at currently, where inherently just doesn't make sense for a drug company to invest in that. But if it were to be kind of more of a focus, I mean, obviously there is a need, and
Yeah.
to be able to kind of pivot that need quickly is
Mhm.
important. It might fall back into the hands of the private sector.
Absolutely. And we talked about this field being just explosive, and the applications and the creativity, everything is inherently experimental. You're right. Can you get a VC's attention? I don't know. Like, unless I can show them, it's got a population of 20,000 patients, and they're well insured. It's a first world issue. Yeah,
Right.
it's a real struggle. Absolutely.
It is 100%. But just kind of thinking here, back to kind of the AI analytics conversation,
Hmm.
and just kind of taking your lens in this space of like what would be an optimal use case, I guess, for all these technologies, and
Yeah.
whether it be private sector, government, like where is this happy utopia?
Yeah.
You
I
get
won't say
to
single payer.
yes, you get to paint the future, Paul.
Yeah, I will say something which might be a little bit controversial, I think, which is, look, the FDA is in a place now where it is about half funded with user fees, paid out of pocket by sponsors to support the product reviews. So medical devices, biologics, and drugs, and other sectors. And the risk, I remember in the early 90s when this first was done, the PDUFA, the Prescription Drug User Fee Act of 92. So that shows you how old I am. But I do remember that one of the perennial concerns was that you start paying for stuff out of sponsors' pockets, you capture the agency, right? You can't trust the agency to do other than industry's bidding because they're being paid for. Their work was being paid for. And thank goodness that has not been the case. I mean, you can point to any number of indicia you want, but we not only have sustained and increased innovation, but we also see rigor. We see real agency hardball, calling shots, sometimes not in patient interest, but because this statute tells them to look at the data a certain way, and they call those shots, and we've seen companies disappear, right, because they got the no from FDA. So when we look at this emergent field of AI applied across life sciences, across life science innovation, and the agency not being able to say authoritatively that they have the answer, I think that utopia, Brandy, might look like, something that is emerging right now, which is multilateral engagement, standard setting, trust and verify, transparency of data, skepticism about outcomes and claims. CIOs being, whoa, I'm not sure this is the right approach. And I think the federal government being seen as a partner, not as an answer and not as the problem, but as a partner in working towards what the right processes are, right? What the standards should be. This is still de novo, literally de novo for everybody. And I think, like you'd said, again, getting back to the retail politics of this, it requires sustained resourcing and a
Yeah.
commitment. And that commitment could be part of like lawmaking. So Congress may have a role, unfortunately, to play in this, of setting out what the agency should be doing differently. And I think those public-private partnerships are inevitably going to be part of that fabric to ensure that, when AI hits the field, it doesn't come crashing down in a thalidomide sort of way. And I know that's a
Mhm.
doomsaying way of saying it, but we want to instill confidence in how this is applied, right? We want to have understanding and comprehension. And to get back to COVID again, if you don't have them buying in at that fundamental level, they will always look askance at how we're using the technology, and we cannot afford that. And this goes back in a sense to the 70s and recombinant DNA, right? And one of the one things that happened was the Asilomar conference, where the scientists themselves said, whoa, we're going to take it slow and be transparent, and we're going to be accountable. And I think from the commercial side, the developers, we need to be willing to make that kind of commitment as well. It's not going to be the Wild West. We're not going to be disruptive for the sake of disruption. No, we're going to be, social actors, partners in this. So it may not involve chaining ourselves, but it may involve signing on to agreements, concordances, right? Agree,
Mhm.
that kind of multilateral assurance that nobody's going to stick somebody else in the eye when the other one's not looking. I
Yeah.
had to put it
No.
plain.
No, but it's so true. I mean, something that you said a couple times was transparency. And I
Yeah.
do think that that is one of the more beautiful things that can come of this, right?
Mhm.
Across the board, because we all know that transparency breeds trust.
Yes. Yes. Yeah.
The more
And that
information you
includes, I
have.
think, exposing yourself to a level of accountability that isn't required under SEC, right? Or, under commercial law. No. This is about really building those foundation blocks for the field.
Mhm.
And sometimes that may require some discomfort.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, yeah. And just being inherently ready for that,
Yeah.
and doing the right thing, right?
Right. Right.
Everyone's not because you have to, but because you know
Yeah.
it's for the greater good.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well said.
Paul, this has been an absolute pleasure and fascinating conversation. I feel like we could probably carry this on for another hour. I'm wondering if you could just, as we kind of wrap this conversation, knowing that this this field
Mm.
is changing and changing rapidly, and technology really fueling that change,
Mm.
and this need to kind of come together, not only as private but also government agencies. Could you leave us just with kind of maybe three pieces of advice to our listeners of how how we can best kind of move forward in this age?
Yeah, I will go back, Brandy, to the lessons I learned from my bosses. I think about what a Henry Waxman or a Ted Kennedy would say about what comes next for the field. And the first thing that they always did to accomplish their lawmaking was, and I think this is true also for what we're talking about, which is uh, appropriate regulation for the field for AI and life sciences. I think one is like there is no partisanship here. That
Mm,
there are commonly held goals, and that we do need to sort of reach across the aisle, and in this case across sectors, to recognize that, to validate that, to acknowledge the good intentions of other actors, and then to work towards understanding how to meet what they need as well as what you want.
mm,
That spirit of collaboration, in their case, it was bipartisanship. In our case, it would be multi-sectoral cooperation, collaboration, has to be sort of a mutually understood and acknowledged foundation for what comes next. And then I think that the rest of it, honestly, is process, right? It's about sharing your knowledge, arguing your case, right? Um, Everything else comes from that. But without it, without that sort of, yes, I understand what you're trying to do. I see the value, what you're trying to bring to the market and to patients. But, here's what I'm saying, that
yeah,
conversation, right? How do you convene that? How do you have that? How do you make sure everybody is involved who needs to be involved? Yeah, that's a difficult, I don't know if that's an AI czar, that's a level of detail I'm not sure about. But I think
Yeah.
this kind of conversation, this kind of socialization is wonderful, Brandy. I think you're doing a public service, right? Because, we add to these voices, maybe something like this will happen.
Yeah, absolutely. No, that was fantastic. Thank you for leaving us with that. That was beautifully said. So we need collaboration amongst all players,
Mm,
sectors, um, and because preparing for the future. It's
yeah.
fantastic. Paul, thank you so much for joining Katalyze today, and I look forward to talking to you again.
Oh, anytime, Brandy. It was a delight.
Thank you.